Blackwells New Life. Arlington, 1921. Felicia Monroe peered into an antique mirror and saw not her own reflection, but that of a sorrowful soldier engraved Captain Henry Rhodes, vanishing as quickly as he appeared. Chapter 1. The Midnight Reflection. The grandfather clock in the hall chimed 12, each resonant note a hammer blow against the fragile stillness of Felicia Monroe's Arlington home. 1921. 3 years since the guns had fallen silent. 3 years since the telegram had arrived, crisp and cruel, bearing the news that had shattered her world. Yet, the echoes of war, the phantom pains of loss, lingered like the scent of gunpowder after a battle. She sat in her late husband's study, a room preserved in amber. Every book, every pipe, every faded photograph a testament to a life lived and abruptly ended. The antique mirror, a wedding gift from Arthur's eccentric Aunt Beatrice, dominated one wall. It was a grand, ornate thing, its silvered surface swirling with age, framed by intricately carved roses that seemed to weep in the dim light of the single lamp on Arthur's desk. Felicia had avoided the study, avoided the mirror, for months, the memories too raw, the silence too deafening. Tonight, however, a restless unease, a prickling at the back of her neck, had drawn her in. She'd been going through Arthur's papers, a task she'd repeatedly postponed, the neat stacks of correspondence, legal documents, and personal effects a daunting reminder of the life they'd planned, the future stolen from them. A small, velvet-lined box had caught her attention. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded silk, lay a single, tarnished silver button, engraved with the insignia of Arthur's regiment. She'd held it to her cheek, the cold metal a stark contrast to the sudden, unexpected rush of warmth that flooded her. And then, she'd looked up. The room was reflected back at her, familiar yet subtly distorted by the aged glass. The heavy oak desk, the overflowing bookshelves, the worn leather armchair where Arthur had spent countless hours reading, all rendered in shades of gray and shadow. But in the center, where her own reflection should have been, stood a man. He was a soldier, his uniform rumpled and stained, his face gaunt and shadowed. Deep lines etched the corners of his eyes that held a profound sadness, a weariness that seemed to seep from the very glass. He looked lost. For a fleeting second, their eyes met, his a startling, almost heartbreaking shade of blue, even in the monochrome reflection. He didn't smile, didn't speak, simply stared at her with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. Beneath his collar, she could just make out the glint of a silver chain. Engraved on the glass, just below the soldier's ghostly form, in elegant, flowing script, were the words, Captain Henry Rhodes. Then, as quickly as he had appeared, he was gone. The mirror reflected only Felicia, her face pale and drawn, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and something else. Something that felt disturbingly like recognition. She blinked, her heart hammering against her ribs. Had she imagined it? The strain of the evening, the grief that still clung to her like a shroud, could easily have conjured the image. Yet, the name Captain Henry Rhodes, it resonated with a strange familiarity, a whisper from a forgotten dream. Felicia reached out a trembling hand and touched the cold glass, her fingers tracing the invisible inscription. The surface was smooth, unbroken, offering no clue to the apparition she'd just witnessed. She stepped back, wrapping her arms around herself, a sudden chill sweeping through the room despite the lingering warmth of the late summer night. She glanced around the study, her gaze lingering on a framed photograph of Arthur on the desk. He was smiling, his arm slung casually around her shoulder, his eyes filled with a light that had been extinguished too soon. She'd loved him, deeply, fiercely. But their love had been a quiet, steady flame, a comforting warmth against the everyday chill of life. This vision, this Captain Rhodes, had stirred something different within her, a restless yearning, a flicker of something that felt dangerously close to hope. The logical part of her mind, the part that had meticulously organized Arthur's life, that had navigated the complexities of wartime society with grace and efficiency, screamed at her to dismiss it. A trick of the light, a figment of her grief-stricken imagination. But another part, a deeper, more intuitive part, whispered that this was more than just a hallucination. This was a sign, a message, a connection. She spent the rest of the night poring over Arthur's belongings, searching for any mention of Captain Henry Rhodes. She found nothing. No letters, no photographs, no references in his meticulously kept journals. It was as if the man had existed only in that fleeting moment in the mirror. As dawn broke, painting the sky in shades of pale pink and gray, Felicia sat exhausted, her eyes burning, her mind racing. She'd found a small, locked wooden box hidden at the back of a drawer, a box she'd never seen before. The key was nowhere to be found. She stared at the box, her fingers tracing the intricate carvings on its surface, a sense of foreboding settling over her. The vision of Captain Rhodes, his sorrowful eyes, the engraved name on the mirror, the hidden box, it was all connected. She was sure of it. But how? And what did it mean? She felt a pull, an undeniable urge to unravel the mystery, to uncover the truth behind the ghostly soldier. It was a dangerous path. She knew, a path that could lead her back into the heart of the war's lingering darkness. But she couldn't ignore it. It felt like a calling, a second chance, a chance, perhaps, to finally understand the war that had taken her husband, and to find a piece of herself that she thought had been lost forever. The first tendril of sunlight touched the locked box. Something about the light's warmth, the glow against the boxwood and brass lock, gave Felicia resolve. The war may be over, but her battle, it seemed, was just beginning. Chapter 2. Echoes of the Psalm. The locksmith, a Mr. Henderson, arrived mid-morning, a small, wiry man with nimble fingers and a perpetually inquisitive expression. He examined the locked box with a practiced eye, his fingers tracing the delicate carvings of poppies and intertwined thorns that adorned its surface. Beautiful piece, he murmured, more to himself than to Felicia. Continental, probably pre-war. Felicia watched him work, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The anticipation was almost unbearable. The vision of Captain Henry Rhodes haunted her, the image of his sorrowful face superimposed on every thought, every action. She'd barely slept, tossing and turning in her bed, the silence of the house amplifying the unanswered questions that echoed in her mind. "Any idea what's inside, Mrs. Monroe?" Mr. Henderson asked, his voice pulling her back to the present. "None at all," Felicia replied, her voice a little shaky. "It belonged to my late husband. He never mentioned it." The lie tasted bitter on her tongue. Arthur had been meticulous, almost obsessively so, about his belongings. He wouldn't have simply forgotten about a box like this. The fact that he'd kept it hidden, locked away, suggested something significant. Something he hadn't wanted her to see. With a soft click, the lock sprung open. Mr. Henderson carefully lifted the lid, revealing the contents within. Felicia leaned forward, her breath catching in her throat. The box was filled with letters. Dozens of them, tied together with faded ribbons, the paper yellowed and brittle with age. The handwriting on the top envelope was not Arthur's. It was a bolder, more angular script, the ink faded but still legible. The return address simply read, Captain H. Rhodes, 17th Battalion, British Expeditionary Force, France. Felicia felt a chill run down her spine. The name, the very name that had appeared in the mirror. It was real. He was real. Carefully, almost reverently, she lifted the top letter from the box. The date on the postmark was smudged, but she could make out the year, 1916. The Somme, the bloodiest battle of the war, a name synonymous with unimaginable horror and loss. She began to read. The letter was addressed to my dearest Arthur, and it spoke of the horrors of trench warfare, the constant fear, the relentless shelling, the mud and the blood, and the screams of dying men. But it also spoke of courage, of camaraderie, of the unwavering loyalty between soldiers facing unimaginable odds. It spoke of hope, a fragile, flickering flame in the darkness, a hope for a future that seemed increasingly distant. And it spoke of Felicia. Not by name, but by description. "The woman I dream of," Henry Rhodes had written, "has eyes the color of a summer sky after a storm and a smile that could melt the frost on a winter's morning. She is kind and strong and brave, and she is the reason I fight, the reason I hold on to hope, even when all seems lost." Felicia's hands trembled as she read the words. Arthur had never spoken of her like that. Their love had been built on shared values, mutual respect, a quiet understanding that transcended passionate declarations. This was different. This was a love forged in fire, a desperate yearning for something beautiful and pure amidst the ugliness of war. She read through several more letters, each one a window into Henry Rhodes's soul, a testament to his enduring love for Arthur and his unwavering belief in a future that included Felicia. The letters chronicled their friendship, their shared experiences, their mutual respect and admiration. They revealed a bond that went far beyond the usual camaraderie of soldiers. It was a deep, abiding affection, a brotherhood forged in the crucible of war. But as she delved deeper into the correspondence, a growing unease began to creep into her heart. There were gaps in the timeline, weeks, sometimes months, where no letters were written. And there were subtle hints, veiled references to a secret, a shared burden that weighed heavily on both men. One letter, dated just weeks before Arthur's death, was particularly disturbing. "I fear the truth will be revealed," Henry had written, "and when it is, everything we have fought for will be lost. We must be strong, Arthur, for her sake. We must protect her, no matter the cost." Protect her from what? Felicia wondered, her heart pounding in her chest. What truth? What cost? The final letter in the box was dated the day before Arthur's death. It was short, almost frantic. "They know," Henry had written. "They're coming for us. I don't know how much time we have. Meet me at the crossroads, by the old oak tree. Midnight. We must." The letter ended abruptly, the last word unfinished, the ink smeared as if the pen had been dropped mid-sentence. Felicia stared at the letter, her mind reeling. The crossroads. The old oak tree. She knew the place. It was on the outskirts of their village, a secluded spot where she and Arthur had often gone for walks before the war. A place of quiet beauty, now tainted by the shadow of a hidden secret. She looked up at the clock. It was almost noon. 12 hours. 12 hours until midnight. 12 hours to unravel the mystery that had suddenly consumed her life. She knew she had to go to the crossroads. She had to find out what had happened that night, what secret Henry and Arthur had been so desperate to protect. And she had to find out what it all meant for her. The wind began to pick up outside. The faint sound of rustling leaves became that of a distant, relentless march. Chapter 3. The Widow's Scarf. Felicia changed into a simple, dark dress, the fabric soft and worn, a comforting familiarity against the sudden chill that had settled over her. She couldn't shake the image of the unfinished letter, the urgency in Henry's handwriting, the sense of impending doom that clung to the words like a shroud. They know. They're coming for us. Who were they? And what did they know? She needed something of Arthur's, something to connect her to him, to give her strength. She went to the wardrobe, her fingers tracing the familiar lines of his suits, the lingering scent of his pipe tobacco clinging to the fabric. She reached for his favorite overcoat, a heavy, tweed garment he'd worn on countless walks in the countryside. As she pulled it from the hanger, a small, silk scarf slipped from the pocket and fluttered to the floor. It was a woman's scarf, a delicate, cream-colored silk embroidered with intricate patterns of forget-me-nots and tiny, crimson hearts. Felicia had never seen it before. It certainly wasn't hers. Her style was more practical, less romantic. This scarf spoke of a different kind of woman, a woman of elegance and refinement, a woman who perhaps inspired the kind of passionate devotion Henry Rhodes had written about in his letters. She held the scarf to her face, inhaling the faint, lingering scent of perfume. It was a subtle, floral fragrance, with a hint of something deeper, something musky and alluring. It was a scent that stirred a vague, unsettling memory, a fleeting image of a woman she couldn't quite place. A wave of jealousy, sharp and unexpected, washed over her. She'd always known, on some level, that Arthur had a life before her, a past she hadn't been a part of. But she'd never imagined this. A secret lover?
A hidden romance?
The thought was almost unbearable. But as she examined the scarf more closely, her jealousy began to give way to a different kind of emotion. A sense of sadness. The embroidery was exquisite, the work of a skilled hand, but there were signs of wear, tiny imperfections that spoke of a scarf that had been loved and cherished. And on one corner, almost hidden amongst the flowers, she found a small, embroidered initial, E.E. Not F for Felicia.
Who was E?
Another woman in Arthur's life? Or someone else? Someone connected to Henry Rhodes? The questions multiplied, swirling in her mind like the wind that was now howling outside, rattling the windows and shaking the branches of the old oak tree in the garden. She felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to leave, to escape the confines of the house, the suffocating weight of Arthur's secrets. She wrapped the silk scarf around her neck, the soft fabric a comforting presence against her skin. It felt strangely right, as if she were meant to wear it. She grabbed Arthur's overcoat, the heavy fabric offering a sense of protection against the gathering storm. She hesitated for a moment, glancing back at the study, at the antique mirror that had started it all. The reflection was her own now, her face pale and determined, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and anticipation. She stepped out into the storm, the wind whipping her hair around her face, the rain stinging her skin. She didn't know where she was going, what she would find, but she knew she couldn't stay. She had to follow the threads of the mystery, to unravel the secrets that had been hidden for so long. As she walked, the scent of the perfume on the scarf filled her senses, guiding her, leading her forward. It was a familiar scent, she realized, a scent she'd encountered before, somewhere in the distant past. A memory flickered at the edge of her consciousness, a fleeting image of a crowded ballroom, a handsome officer in uniform, a woman with laughing eyes and a cream-colored scarf. The memory vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving her with a sense of unease, a feeling that she was walking into a trap, a web of secrets and lies that had been spun long before she'd ever entered the picture. But she couldn't turn back. She had to know the truth, even if it destroyed her. The wind tore at her coat, threatening to rip it open, just like she was trying to do with the secrets she'd found. Chapter 4. Letters from a Stranger. The walk to the crossroads was longer than Felicia remembered, the familiar country lanes transformed by the storm into a treacherous landscape of mud and puddles. The wind howled like a banshee, tearing at her coat, and the rain lashed against her face, blurring her vision. She clutched the edges of Arthur's overcoat, the heavy tweed a small comfort against the elements. The silk scarf, tucked securely around her neck, felt like a talisman, a connection to the unknown E and the secrets she held. As she walked, she thought about the letters, about the passionate, almost desperate tone of Henry Rhodes's writing. He had loved Arthur, that much was clear. But what kind of love? And what was the secret they had shared, the secret that had cost them their lives? She reached into the pocket of the overcoat and pulled out the last, unfinished letter. "They know," she read again, her voice barely a whisper above the roar of the wind. "They're coming for us." The words sent a shiver down her spine. Suddenly, a flash of lightning illuminated the landscape, revealing the silhouette of the old oak tree in the distance. It stood on a small rise, its branches gnarled and twisted, its trunk scarred by lightning strikes from storms past. It was a lonely, desolate place, a fitting setting for a secret rendezvous, a desperate plea for help. As she drew closer, she noticed a small, stone bench nestled beneath the tree, partially hidden by the overgrown bushes. She sat down, her legs aching, her body shivering from the cold. She pulled the scarf tighter around her neck, inhaling the faint, lingering scent of perfume. She waited. The minutes ticked by, each one an eternity. The storm raged around her, the wind and the rain a constant, deafening roar. She felt a growing sense of dread, a feeling that she was alone, abandoned, that no one was coming. And then she heard it. A faint sound, almost lost in the noise of the storm. A rustling in the bushes, the snapping of a twig. She held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. A figure emerged from the darkness, a tall, slender silhouette against the stormy sky. It was a woman. She was wearing a long, dark coat, her face hidden by a wide-brimmed hat. She walked slowly, hesitantly, as if unsure of her footing. Felicia stood up, her legs trembling. "Hello?" She called out, her voice shaky. The woman stopped, her head turning towards Felicia.
"Who's there?"
she asked, her voice muffled by the wind. "It's Felicia," Felicia replied. "Felicia Monroe." The woman hesitated for a moment, then slowly approached. As she drew closer, Felicia could see her face, pale and drawn, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and recognition. "Felicia?" the woman whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm. "Arthur's wife." Felicia nodded, her heart pounding. "And you are?" The woman hesitated again, then slowly reached up and removed her hat. Her hair, a cascade of dark curls, tumbled down around her shoulders. She was beautiful, Felicia realized, with a delicate, almost ethereal beauty that seemed out of place in the harsh surroundings. And her eyes were the color of a summer sky after a storm. "My name is Eleanor," the woman said, her voice trembling. "Eleanor Rhodes." Felicia felt a jolt, a sudden, sharp intake of breath.
Rhodes.
Henry Rhodes' sister? The E on the scarf? It all clicked into place, a sudden, terrifying revelation. I found your scarf," Felicia said, her voice barely a whisper. "In Arthur's coat." Eleanor's eyes widened. She reached out and touched the scarf, her fingers tracing the embroidered forget-me-nots. "He kept it," she whispered, her voice filled with a mixture of sadness and wonder. He loved you, didn't he?" Felicia asked, the question a painful admission. Eleanor nodded, tears streaming down her face, mingling with the rain.
"And I loved him," she said.
"With all my heart." But before Felicia could ask the next question, the question that had been burning in her mind since she'd read Henry's letters, a sudden noise made them both jump. The sound of a car engine approaching fast. "We have to go," Eleanor said, her voice urgent. "They're coming." The same words used in the letter. The same chilling tone. The same enemy. Chapter 5. The Officer's Ball. Eleanor grabbed Felicia's hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "This way," she urged, pulling her towards a narrow, overgrown path that led away from the crossroads and into the dense woods. The car's headlights swept across the road, momentarily illuminating the empty space where they had been standing just seconds before. They ran, stumbling through the undergrowth, the branches whipping at their faces, the mud sucking at their shoes. Felicia could hear the car slowing down, the crunch of tires on gravel, the slamming of doors. Voices, harsh and guttural, echoed through the trees. "Who are they?" Felicia gasped, her breath coming in ragged bursts. "Spies," Eleanor replied, her voice tight with fear. "They worked for the Germans. They found out about Henry and Arthur." The revelation hit Felicia like a physical blow. Arthur?
A spy?
It seemed impossible. He had been the epitome of patriotism, a staunch supporter of the war effort, a man who had dedicated his life to serving his country. But the evidence was undeniable. The letters, the secret rendezvous, Eleanor's terrified flight, it all pointed to a hidden truth, a dark secret that had been buried for years. They reached a small, dilapidated shed, hidden deep within the woods. Eleanor fumbled with a rusty padlock, her hands shaking. "The key," she muttered. I don't have the key." Felicia remembered the small, skeleton key she'd found tucked into the lining of Arthur's overcoat pocket, a key she'd almost dismissed as insignificant. She pulled it out, her fingers trembling. "Try this," she said, her voice barely a whisper. The key slid into the lock, and with a click, the padlock sprung open. Eleanor pushed open the door, revealing a dark, musty interior. They slipped inside, pulling the door shut behind them. The shed was small and cramped, filled with cobwebs and the scent of decay. There was a single, grimy window covered with a thick layer of dust. Eleanor peered through a small crack, her body tense. "They're still out there," she whispered. "Searching." Felicia sank to the floor, her back against the cold, damp wall. She closed her eyes, trying to control her racing heart, her swirling thoughts. Arthur, a spy. It was a betrayal, not just of his country, but of her, of their marriage, of everything she had believed in. But as she thought about it, a different picture began to emerge. Arthur hadn't been working for the Germans. He had been working against them. He and Henry had been gathering intelligence, passing information to the Allies, risking their lives to help win the war.
"Why didn't he tell me?"
Felicia whispered, the question a painful lament. Eleanor turned to her, her eyes filled with compassion.
"He couldn't," she said.
"It was too dangerous."
"He was protecting you."
Protecting her. The words echoed in Felicia's mind. It was the same phrase Henry had used in his letter. "We must protect her, no matter the cost." But what were they doing? Felicia asked. What was the secret? Eleanor hesitated, her gaze flickering towards the window. They were working with a network of informants, she said. Passing information about troop movements, supply lines, that sort of thing. But there was something more, something bigger. She paused, her breath catching in her throat. "There was a leak," she said. Someone within the British intelligence service was passing information to the Germans. Henry and Arthur were trying to find out who it was. A leak. A traitor. The implications were staggering. It meant that countless lives had been lost, battles had been fought in vain, all because of one person's betrayal. And they found out who it was? Felicia asked, her voice barely a whisper. Eleanor nodded, her eyes filled with a dark, haunting sadness. "Yes," she said. "They found out. And that's why they were killed." She stopped suddenly and grabbed Felicia's arm. "Listen." From outside, they could hear the distinct snap of a twig, then hushed voices. They were close. Too close. Eleanor extinguished the small lantern they had lit. In the dark, Felicia could only make out the sharp intake of Eleanor's breath. A new memory surfaced: an officer's ball, a handsome man in a British uniform, and Eleanor, radiant, on his arm. The man had cold eyes. And he was looking directly at Arthur. Chapter 6. Beneath the gaslit streets. The voices outside grew closer, the beam of a flashlight flickering through the cracks in the shed's walls. Felicia and Eleanor held their breath, pressed against the back wall, their hearts pounding in unison. They could hear the men searching, their boots crunching on the leaves, their voices low and menacing. "They must have gone this way," one of the men said, his voice harsh and guttural. "Find them." The flashlight beams swept across the window, momentarily illuminating the interior of the shed. Felicia closed her eyes, bracing herself for the inevitable. But the light moved on, and the voices gradually faded away. They waited in silence, listening intently for any sign of the men's return. The only sound was the relentless drumming of the rain on the roof of the shed, the wind howling through the trees. "They're gone," Eleanor whispered, her voice trembling with relief. "For now." But the danger was far from over. They were stranded in the middle of nowhere, hunted by ruthless spies, with no idea who they could trust. "We have to get out of here," Felicia said, her voice firm despite her fear. "We have to get to London." London. The heart of British intelligence, the place where Henry and Arthur had been working, the place where they might find the answers they were seeking. But how? Eleanor asked, her voice filled with despair. "The roads are blocked. The trains are being watched." Felicia remembered something Arthur had told her, a long-forgotten detail from one of his stories about his time in London. "There's an underground network," she said. "Tunnels, abandoned stations used by smugglers, spies during the war." Arthur had mentioned it in passing, a casual remark about the city's hidden underbelly. He'd never elaborated, never hinted at his own involvement. But now, it seemed like their only hope. "Do you know how to find it?" Eleanor asked, her voice filled with a flicker of hope. Felicia shook her head. "No," she said. "But I know someone who might." She thought of Mrs. Abernathy, Arthur's elderly aunt, the same woman who had given them the antique mirror. She was a peculiar woman, eccentric and reclusive, but she had a vast knowledge of London's history, its secrets, its hidden pathways. "We have to get to her house," Felicia said. "She's our only chance." They waited until nightfall, then slipped out of the shed, creeping through the woods, avoiding the main roads. They walked for hours, their bodies aching, their feet soaked and blistered. The storm had finally subsided, leaving behind a clear, star-studded sky. But the beauty of the night was lost on them, their minds consumed by fear and uncertainty. They reached the outskirts of London just as dawn was breaking, the city shrouded in a thick fog. The gaslights cast an eerie glow on the wet streets, the buildings looming like ghostly shadows. They found Mrs. Abernathy's house in a quiet, secluded alleyway, a narrow, 3-story building with a faded facade and a cluttered garden. Felicia knocked on the door, her heart pounding. After a long wait, the door creaked open, revealing a frail, elderly woman with sharp, intelligent eyes and a cloud of white hair. Mrs. Abernathy peered at them through thick spectacles, her expression a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. "Felicia?" she said, her voice raspy. "What are you doing here? And at this hour?" "We need your help, Aunt Beatrice," Felicia said, her voice urgent. "It's about Arthur and Henry." Mrs. Abernathy's eyes widened. She stepped back, inviting them inside. The house was a labyrinth of narrow corridors and cluttered rooms, filled with antique furniture, dusty books, and strange, exotic artifacts. The air was thick with the scent of incense and old paper. They followed her into a small, dimly lit parlor, where a fire crackled in the hearth. Felicia and Eleanor told her everything about the letters, the scarf, the spies, the underground network. Mrs. Abernathy listened intently, her eyes never leaving their faces. When they had finished, she sat in silence for a long moment, her fingers tapping on the arm of her chair. "I knew it," she said finally, her voice low and grave. "I knew there was something wrong. Arthur was always so secretive about his work. And Henry, he was a good man, a brave man. But he was caught up in something dangerous. Do you know about the underground network?" Felicia asked, her voice filled with hope. Mrs. Abernathy nodded. "Yes," she said. "I know it well. My father was a collector of sorts. He had a fascination with London's hidden history. He mapped the tunnels, the abandoned stations, the secret passages." She rose from her chair, her movements slow and deliberate. She led them to a large, oak bookcase that covered one wall of the parlor. She pressed a hidden button, and with a click, a section of the bookcase swung open, revealing a narrow, dark passageway. "This will lead you to the network," she said. "But be careful. It's a dangerous place. And you are not the only ones who know about it." She paused and faced them, her old eyes filled with grave warning. "The man you saw at the ball, Sir Alistair Finch. He's the one. Be warned." The name sent a shiver of confirmation down Felicia's spine. The cold-eyed man. The traitor. Chapter 7. A Promise in Peril. The passageway was narrow and damp, the air thick with the smell of mildew and dust. Mrs. Abernathy had given them a small, oil lamp, its flickering flame casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. Felicia and Eleanor walked in silence, their footsteps echoing in the confined space. The weight of Mrs. Abernathy's warning, "Sir Alistair Finch. He's the one," pressed heavily on Felicia's mind. The image of the officer's ball, Finch's cold eyes fixed on Arthur, replayed itself over and over. "How did she know?" Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible above the dripping of water from the ceiling. "About Finch?" Felicia replied. "I don't know. But she knew Arthur was involved in something dangerous. She probably knew more than she ever let on." They reached a junction, the passageway branching off in 2 directions. Felicia held up the lamp, examining the walls for any markings, any clues. She remembered Arthur mentioning a specific symbol, a circle bisected by a vertical line, that marked the main route through the network. "There," Eleanor said, pointing to a faint etching on the wall, almost obscured by moss and grime. It was the symbol Arthur had described. They followed the marked passageway, the tunnel gradually widening, the air growing colder. They could hear the faint rumble of trains overhead, the sounds of the city muffled but still present. Henry and Arthur must have used these tunnels, Eleanor said, her voice filled with a mixture of sadness and awe. To move around undetected, to meet their contacts. Felicia nodded, her thoughts racing. She imagined them, two young men, navigating this labyrinthine network, risking their lives for a cause they believed in. And she imagined them falling in love, their feelings deepening amidst the danger and the secrecy. They reached a large, vaulted chamber, the remnants of an abandoned underground station. The platforms were crumbling, the tracks rusted and overgrown. The air was thick with dust and the smell of decay. "This must be it," Felicia said. "This must be where they met." They searched the chamber, looking for any sign of Henry and Arthur, any clue that might lead them to Finch. They found nothing. Just the ghostly remnants of a bygone era, the echoes of a city that had once thrived beneath the streets. As they were about to leave, Eleanor noticed something on the wall, a small, wooden box, partially hidden behind a loose brick. She pulled it out, her hands trembling. It was similar to the box Felicia had found in Arthur's study, the same intricate carvings of poppies and thorns. Felicia recognized the lock. It was the same type as the one Mr. Henderson had opened. She reached into the pocket of Arthur's overcoat, pulling out the skeleton key. It fit. With a click, the lock sprung open. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, lay a single, folded piece of paper. Felicia carefully unfolded it, her heart pounding.
It was a map.
The map depicted a section of the London docks, with several buildings marked with specific symbols. One building, a large warehouse near the river, was circled in red. And beneath the circle, written in Henry's familiar handwriting, were the words, "The Serpent's Nest." The Serpent's Nest. The name sent a shiver down Felicia's spine. It sounded ominous, dangerous. It was clearly the place where Finch was operating, the center of his treacherous network. "We have to go there," Eleanor said, her voice firm. "We have to expose him." Felicia hesitated. It was a dangerous mission, a confrontation with a powerful and ruthless man. They were two women, unarmed and alone, against a network of spies and assassins. But she knew they couldn't turn back. They had come too far, risked too much. They had a duty, not just to Henry and Arthur, but to all those who had suffered because of Finch's betrayal. "We'll go," Felicia said, her voice resolute. "But we need a plan." They spent the next few hours studying the map, memorizing the layout of the docks, the location of the warehouse. They knew they couldn't simply walk in, guns blazing. They needed to be smart, to be stealthy, to use the element of surprise. Before they could make any concrete plan, however, a distant clang echoed through the tunnels. Someone was coming. They quickly closed and replaced the box and slipped back behind the loose brick, just as a figure rounded the corner, lantern held high. He was whistling a Johnny tune, completely unaware of their presence. Felicia steeled herself. This was their only chance. A promise made to Arthur, to Henry, and now, to Eleanor, had to be kept. Chapter 8. The Secret of Room 11. The figure approached, his lantern casting a flickering light on the damp walls of the abandoned station. He was a burly man, with a rough, unshaven face and a heavy overcoat that concealed his form. He carried a toolbox in one hand, the tools clinking together with each step. He continued to whistle, the tune echoing eerily in the cavernous space. Felicia and Eleanor exchanged a look. They had to act quickly, before he discovered them. Felicia nodded to Eleanor, signaling her to stay put. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for what she was about to do. As the man passed by, Felicia stepped out from behind the brick wall, blocking his path. He stopped abruptly, his eyes widening in surprise. "Excuse me," Felicia said, her voice trembling slightly. "Can you help us? We're lost." The man looked at her suspiciously, his eyes scanning her from head to toe. "Lost?" he said, his voice gruff. "What are you doing down here? This ain't no place for ladies." We took a wrong turn," Felicia said, trying to sound innocent and confused. "We were looking for the exit." The man grunted.
There ain't no exit this way, he said.
You'll have to go back the way you came. He started to move past her, but Felicia stepped in front of him again. Please, she said, her voice pleading. We're desperate. We've been down here for hours. The man hesitated, his eyes narrowing. He looked at Felicia, then at Eleanor, who was still hidden in the shadows. He seemed to be weighing his options, deciding whether to help them or to raise the alarm. Felicia knew she had to act fast. She reached into the pocket of Arthur's overcoat, her fingers closing around the small, silver button she'd found in the velvet box, the button from Henry's uniform. She pulled it out, holding it up so the man could see it. This belonged to my husband, she said, her voice catching in her throat. Captain Arthur Monroe. He used to work down here. The man's eyes widened. He recognized the insignia on the button. He took a step back, his expression changing from suspicion to fear. Captain Monroe? He said, his voice barely a whisper.
He's dead.
Yes, Felicia said. He died a hero. And he left me a message. A message about room 11. The man's face paled. He took another step back, his hand reaching for something inside his coat. Felicia knew he was reaching for a weapon, a knife or a gun. Room 11, he muttered. How do you know about that? My husband told me, Felicia lied, her voice steady despite her fear. He told me everything. It was a gamble, a desperate attempt to gain the upper hand. She had no idea what room 11 was, but the man's reaction told her it was something important, something secret. The man hesitated, his hand still inside his coat. He looked at Felicia, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and uncertainty. He was clearly torn, unsure of what to do. I can't talk about it, he said, his voice trembling. It's forbidden. Forbidden by whom? Felicia asked, pressing her advantage. By Sir Alistair Finch? The man's eyes widened. He gasped, his hand dropping from his coat.
He knew he'd been caught.
You know, he whispered. You know about everything. Yes, Felicia said. And we're going to expose him. We're going to bring him to justice. The man looked at her, his eyes filled with a strange mixture of fear and relief. He seemed to be making a decision, weighing the risks, the consequences. Finally he spoke. Room 11, he said, his voice low and grave. It's where Finch keeps his records. Evidence of his treachery. Proof of his betrayal. Where is it? Felicia asked, her heart pounding. It's in the warehouse, the man said. The serpent's nest. But it's heavily guarded. You'll never get in. We have to try, Felicia said. We have to get that evidence. The man hesitated, then nodded. I'll help you, he said. I can't stand by and watch him get away with it any longer. My name is Thomas. I worked for Finch, but I never knew the full extent of his crimes. I owed Captain Monroe a debt. He saved my life once, during the war. Thomas explained that he was a maintenance worker, responsible for keeping the tunnels and abandoned stations in good repair. He knew the layout of the network intimately, and he had access to keys, tools, and information that could help them. He led them through a series of hidden passageways, avoiding the main routes, the areas where Finch's men were likely to be patrolling. They reached a small, hidden chamber, located directly beneath the warehouse. This is as far as I can take you, Thomas said. From here, you're on your own. There's a secret passage that leads up into the warehouse, directly to room 11. But it's locked. And it's guarded. He handed Felicia a small, rusty key. This is the key to the passage, he said. But be careful. Finch is ruthless. He won't hesitate to kill you. He paused. The lock is a double cylinder. This key only opens one side. The other. He trailed off, then looked down. Only Finch has that one. Felicia felt a sudden surge of despair. It was impossible. Chapter 9. Whispers in the Ward. Felicia stared at the key, a wave of despair washing over her. A double lock. It seemed insurmountable. Thomas's words echoed in her mind. Only Finch has that one. How could they possibly get past it? There has to be another way, Eleanor said, her voice filled with a desperate hope. A spare key, a hidden mechanism, something. Thomas shook his head. Finch is meticulous, he said. He doesn't leave anything to chance. That lock is his ultimate safeguard. He designed it himself. Felicia closed her eyes, trying to think. She remembered Arthur's meticulous nature, his love of puzzles and codes. He wouldn't have relied solely on a single key, a single point of failure. There had to be a backup, a contingency plan. The mirror, she said suddenly, her eyes snapping open. The antique mirror Aunt Beatrice gave us. Eleanor and Thomas looked at her, puzzled. What about it? Eleanor asked. It's not just a mirror, Felicia said. It's a container. Like the boxes. I saw Henry's reflection in it, his name engraved on the glass. There has to be something inside. She remembered the intricate carvings on the mirror's frame, the roses that seemed to weep in the dim light. She had a feeling, a strong intuition, that the key to the second lock was hidden within the mirror itself. But how do we get it? Eleanor asked. It's back at Aunt Beatrice's house. We have to go back, Felicia said. It's our only hope. Thomas hesitated.
It's too dangerous, he said.
Finch's men are everywhere. They'll be looking for you. We have to risk it, Felicia said. We can't give up now. They agreed on a plan. Thomas would create a diversion, drawing Finch's men away from Mrs. Abernathy's house. Felicia and Eleanor would sneak back, retrieve the mirror, and then meet Thomas back at the hidden chamber beneath the warehouse. It was a risky plan, fraught with danger. But they had no other choice. They left Thomas at the chamber and retraced their steps through the tunnels, moving quickly and quietly, avoiding any contact with Finch's men. They reached Mrs. Abernathy's house just as night was falling, the streets shrouded in darkness. The house was quiet, seemingly deserted. Felicia knocked on the door, her heart pounding. After a long wait, the door creaked open, revealing Mrs. Abernathy, her face pale and drawn. Felicia? She said, her voice trembling. What happened? Are you all right? We're fine, Aunt Beatrice, Felicia said. But we need the mirror. The antique mirror. It's important. Mrs. Abernathy looked at her, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and understanding. I knew it, she whispered. I knew that mirror held a secret. She led them to the parlor, where the mirror still hung on the wall, its silvered surface reflecting the dim light of the room. Felicia examined the frame, her fingers tracing the intricate carvings. She pressed on the roses one by one, searching for a hidden mechanism, a secret compartment. And then she found it. One of the roses, slightly larger than the others, yielded to her touch. It clicked, and a small section of the frame swung open, revealing a hidden cavity. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, lay a small, silver key. Felicia's heart leaped with joy. It was the key. The second key to the double lock. Thank you, Aunt Beatrice, Felicia said, her voice filled with gratitude. You saved us. Mrs. Abernathy smiled, a faint, sad smile. Be careful, my dear, she said. Finch is a dangerous man, and he has powerful allies. They thanked her again and quickly departed. As they hurried back towards the tunnels, Felicia clutched both keys. A new memory flickered. A hospital ward, filled with wounded soldiers. Henry, lying in bed, his face pale and drawn. Arthur, standing beside him, his hand resting on Henry's arm. And a whisper, barely audible. The mirror the roses, they will bloom again. Felicia's breath caught. It was Henry's voice. A message from beyond the grave. A promise of hope, even in the face of death. The whispered phrase echoed across the distance and the years. A final instruction. A final gift. Chapter 10. The General's Daughter. They returned to the hidden chamber beneath the warehouse, the two keys clutched tightly in Felicia's hand. Thomas was waiting for them, his face etched with worry. Did you get it? He asked, his voice hushed. Felicia nodded, holding up the silver key.
We did, she said.
But we need to hurry. Finch might know we're here. Thomas led them to the secret passage, a narrow, winding staircase that led up into the warehouse. He inserted the rusty key he'd given them earlier into one side of the double lock, turning it with a click. Felicia inserted the silver key from the mirror into the other side, her hand trembling. She turned it. The lock clicked open. They pushed open the heavy, wooden door, revealing a dimly lit corridor. The air was thick with the smell of salt and fish, the sounds of the docks muffled, but still audible. Room 11 is at the end of the corridor, Thomas whispered. But be careful. There are guards posted outside. They crept along the corridor, their footsteps silent on the wooden floor. They could hear the voices of the guards, their laughter, their casual conversation. They reached the door to room 11. It was a heavy, steel door, with no windows, no markings, just a small, brass number plate. 11. Felicia and Eleanor exchanged a look. This was it. The moment of truth. They heard a noise behind them. A footstep, a cough. They turned around, their hearts pounding. A figure emerged from the shadows, a tall, slender woman with fiery red hair and piercing green eyes. She was wearing a long, elegant dress, her demeanor confident and commanding. Well, she said, her voice smooth and silky. What have we here? Snooping around where you don't belong? Felicia recognized her immediately. It was the woman from the officers' ball, the woman she'd seen with Sir Alistair Finch, the woman whose image had flickered in her memory.
Who are you?
Felicia asked, her voice trembling. The woman smiled, a cold, cruel smile.
My name is Genevieve, she said.
Genevieve Dubois. And I'm Sir Alistair's associate. Felicia felt a chill run down her spine. Genevieve Dubois. The name was familiar. She'd heard it somewhere before, and then she remembered. Arthur's journals. He'd mentioned a Genevieve Dubois, a Frenchwoman, the daughter of a high-ranking British general. She was known for her beauty, her charm, her connections. She was also suspected of being a spy, but no one had ever been able to prove it. You're working with Finch, Felicia said, her voice filled with accusation. Genevieve laughed, a low, throaty laugh.
Of course, she said.
He's a brilliant man, and a very generous one. He's a traitor, Eleanor said, her voice trembling with anger. He betrayed his country. He betrayed my brother. Genevieve's smile vanished. Her eyes narrowed, her expression turning cold and menacing.
Your brother was a fool, she said.
He got in the way. He deserved to die. You killed him, Felicia said, her voice shaking. You and Finch. Genevieve shrugged.
We had no choice, she said.
He knew too much. And so do you. She reached into her dress, pulling out a small, silver pistol. She pointed it at Felicia, her finger on the trigger.
It's over, she said.
You're not going to expose us. You're going to die, just like your husband. Felicia closed her eyes, bracing herself for the inevitable. She'd failed. She'd failed Arthur. She'd failed Henry. She'd failed Eleanor. But then, she heard a noise.
A shout, a strangle, a gunshot.
She opened her eyes, her vision blurred. She saw Eleanor wrestling with Genevieve, the pistol flying through the air, landing on the floor with a clatter. Thomas had arrived just in time. He grabbed Genevieve from behind, pinning her arms to her sides.
Run.
He shouted to Felicia and Eleanor. Get the evidence. I'll hold her off. Felicia and Eleanor didn't hesitate. They rushed to the door of room 11, Felicia fumbling with the keys, Eleanor kicking the discarded pistol down the hall. They knew they didn't have much time. The sound of the gunshot would have alerted the other guards. They had to get the evidence and get out before it was too late. The truth and their lives depended on it. The heavy door seemed to mock their frantic efforts. Chapter 11. Betrayal at Dawn. Felicia inserted the 2 keys into the double lock of room 11, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold them. The first key, Thomas's rusty key, turned easily. The second, the silver key from the mirror, resisted for a moment, then clicked into place. The heavy steel door swung open, revealing a small, dimly lit room. The air was thick with the smell of dust and old paper. There were shelves lining the walls, filled with files, documents, ledgers, maps. This was it. Finch's secret archive, the evidence of his treachery. Hurry, Eleanor urged, her voice strained. We don't have much time. They began searching frantically, pulling files from the shelves, scanning the documents, looking for anything that could link Finch to the German spy network. They found ledgers detailing payments to informants, maps showing troop movements and supply lines, coded messages intercepted from German intelligence. And then Felicia found it, a small, leather-bound book, hidden at the back of a shelf. She opened it, her heart pounding. It was a list of names, code names, and real names of people involved in Finch's network. And at the top of the list, written in bold, black ink, was the name, Sir Alistair Finch the Serpent. Below Finch's name was a list of his collaborators, including Genevieve Du Bois, several high-ranking military officials, and Arthur Monroe. Felicia gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Arthur's name, on the list of traitors? It couldn't be true. It had to be a mistake. But as she examined the entry more closely, she saw a small note, written in Arthur's familiar handwriting, next to his name. Double Agent Project Nightingale. Double Agent. Project Nightingale. It all clicked into place. Arthur hadn't been a traitor. He had been working undercover, infiltrating Finch's network, gathering intelligence for the British. He had played the role of a traitor to gain Finch's trust, to get close to him, to expose him. A wave of relief, of pride, of overwhelming sadness washed over her. Arthur had been a hero, after all. He had risked everything, sacrificed everything, to serve his country. We have it, Felicia said, her voice trembling. We have the proof. But just as they were about to leave, they heard a noise outside the door. The sound of footsteps, approaching fast. The other guards had arrived. They were trapped. Suddenly, the door burst open, and several men rushed into the room, their weapons drawn. They were led by Sir Alistair Finch himself, his face contorted with rage. Well, Finch said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Look what we have here. The grieving widow and the grieving sister, snooping around in my private affairs. He looked at Felicia, his eyes filled with a cold, calculating hatred. You should have stayed out of it, Mrs. Monroe, he said. You should have let sleeping dogs lie. I couldn't, Felicia said, her voice firm despite her fear. I had to know the truth. And now I do. You're a traitor, Finch. You betrayed your country. You killed my husband. Finch laughed, a harsh, cruel laugh. Your husband was a fool, he said. He thought he could play me. He thought he could be a hero. But he was wrong. He was just a pawn in my game. He was a better man than you'll ever be, Felicia said, her voice filled with defiance. Finch's smile vanished. He raised his hand, signaling his men to seize them. Take them away, he said, and get rid of them. But just as the guards were about to grab them, a voice rang out from the corridor. Hold it right there, Finch. It was Thomas. He stood at the doorway, holding Genevieve Du Bois at gunpoint, his face grim and determined. Let them go, Finch, Thomas said, or I'll shoot her. Finch hesitated, his eyes flickering between Thomas and Genevieve. He was clearly weighing his options, calculating the risks. You wouldn't dare, Finch said, his voice trembling slightly. Try me, Thomas said, his voice steady. The standoff lasted for several tense seconds, the only sound the heavy breathing of the men and women in the room. Then, suddenly, Genevieve moved. She elbowed Thomas in the stomach, knocking the gun from his hand. She scrambled to her feet, her eyes filled with fury. Kill them, she screamed to the guards. Kill them all. The guards lunged at Felicia and Eleanor, but Thomas tackled one of them, knocking him to the ground. A struggle ensued, a chaotic melee of fists and weapons. Felicia and Eleanor tried to escape, but they were surrounded. Finch grabbed Felicia, his hand clamping over her mouth, his other hand holding a knife to her throat. It's over, Mrs. Monroe, he whispered, his voice cold and menacing. You're going to die, just like your husband. Felicia closed her eyes, bracing herself for the end. She'd failed. She'd failed to avenge Arthur. She'd failed to expose Finch. She'd failed to save Eleanor. The scene outside began to darken, as though a solar eclipse had started. The morning light was disappearing. Chapter 12. The Lost Locket. As Finch pressed the knife closer to Felicia's throat, she felt a surge of adrenaline, a desperate will to survive. She remembered the small, silver locket she'd found amongst Arthur's belongings, a locket she'd been wearing around her neck, hidden beneath her dress. It was a simple locket, engraved with a single, forget-me-not flower. She'd assumed it was a keepsake, a memento of their love. But now, she had a feeling, a desperate hope, that it was something more. With a sudden, swift movement, she reached up and grabbed the locket, pulling it from her neck. She pressed the small, almost invisible clasp, and the locket sprang open. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was not a photograph, as she'd expected, but a small, thin piece of metal, shaped like a key.
It was a key.
A very specific, very unusual key. It was designed for a double-cylinder lock. Finch, momentarily distracted by her movement, loosened his grip slightly. It was all the opportunity Felicia needed. She twisted her body, breaking free from his grasp. She lunged forward, jamming the locket key into the small, almost invisible keyhole on the blade of the knife Finch held. It fit. With a click, the blade retracted, folding back into the handle. The knife, now harmless, fell from Finch's hand. He stared at her, his eyes wide with disbelief. How did you? Felicia didn't answer. She kicked the knife away, then turned to face Eleanor, who was struggling with one of the guards. She grabbed the guard's arm, twisting it behind his back, forcing him to release Eleanor. Thomas, meanwhile, had managed to overpower the other guard. He stood, breathing heavily, his face covered in sweat. "We have to get out of here," he said.
Now.
They ran from the room, down the corridor, towards the secret passage. Finch's men, momentarily stunned by the turn of events, gave chase. They reached the passage, scrambling down the narrow staircase, back into the underground network. They could hear the guards pursuing them, their footsteps echoing in the tunnels. They reached the hidden chamber where they'd left Thomas earlier. They slammed the door shut, locking it with the 2 keys. They were safe for the moment, but they knew Finch wouldn't give up. He would hunt them down, relentlessly, until he'd silence them forever. They had the evidence, the leather-bound book with a list of names, the proof of Finch's treachery. But they needed to get it to the authorities, to someone who could expose Finch and bring him to justice. "We have to get to Scotland Yard," Felicia said. "To Inspector Davies. He was a friend of Arthur's. He can be trusted. But getting to Scotland Yard would be a perilous journey." Finch's men were everywhere, patrolling the streets, watching the train stations, the docks, the airports. They needed a plan, a way to get out of the city undetected. Eleanor looked at Felicia, her eyes filled with a new determination. "I have an idea," she said, and reached inside her own blouse. It wasn't an idea, however, that she shared. It was another locket, identical to Felicia's. Inside was a small, folded piece of paper.
A map.
A map of the London sewer system, with a marked route leading directly to Scotland Yard. The twin lockets. The twin secrets. The twin sisters, perhaps? The revelation hung in the air, unspoken, but undeniable. Chapter 13. Across the barbed wire. The revelation of the identical lockets, the shared secret, hung heavy in the air. Felicia stared at Eleanor, her mind reeling. Twins? Sisters? It seemed impossible, yet the evidence was undeniable. The lockets, the map, the shared connection to Henry and Arthur, it all pointed to a hidden truth, a family secret that had been buried for years. "Eleanor," Felicia began, her voice trembling, "are we?" Eleanor nodded, her eyes filled with tears. "Sisters," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Twin sisters. Separated at birth." She explained the story, a story she'd pieced together from fragments of information, whispered conversations, hidden letters. Their mother, a young woman from a wealthy family, had become pregnant out of wedlock. Scandalized, her family had forced her to give up one of the twins, sending her away to a distant relative to be raised in secrecy. The other twin, Eleanor, had been raised by their mother, believing she was an only child. The father, it turned out, was a soldier, a young officer who had been killed in the early days of the war. He had never known about the twins. Henry, Eleanor's brother, their brother, had discovered the truth years later, through a series of letters he'd found amongst his mother's belongings. He had tracked down Arthur, Felicia's husband, and they had formed a bond, a brotherhood, based on their shared connection to the twins. "But why didn't Arthur tell me?" Felicia asked, her voice filled with a mixture of confusion and hurt. "He promised Henry he wouldn't," Eleanor said. "He wanted to protect you, to shield you from the scandal, the pain. And he was afraid of losing you." Felicia understood. Arthur had always been protective of her, sheltering her from the harsh realities of the world. He had loved her, deeply, fiercely. But his love had been built on a foundation of secrets, of half-truths. They didn't have time to dwell on the past. They had to focus on the present, on the danger that still surrounded them. They had to get to Scotland Yard, to expose Finch, to bring him to justice. Eleanor unfolded the map from her locket, revealing the intricate network of the London sewer system. The marked route led from their current location, beneath the warehouse, to a point just a few blocks from Scotland Yard.
"It's a long shot," Eleanor said.
"But it's our best chance. The sewers are heavily guarded in places, but it's less predictable than the streets above." Thomas, who had been listening intently, nodded in agreement.
"It's risky," he said.
"But it's doable. I know the sewer system well. I used to work down there before I got involved with Finch." They prepared for the journey, gathering supplies, checking their weapons. Felicia still had the locket key, which could be used as a makeshift weapon. Thomas had a wrench, and Eleanor, surprisingly, produced a small, sharp knife from her boot. They entered the sewer system through a hidden access point, located in the basement of the warehouse. The air was foul, thick with the stench of sewage and decay. The tunnels were dark and narrow, the walls slimy and dripping. They moved slowly, cautiously, following the marked route on the map. They encountered rats, spiders, and other unsavory creatures. They waded through pools of stagnant water, climbed over piles of debris, navigated treacherous twists and turns. They encountered several patrols of Finch's men, but they managed to avoid them, using their knowledge of the tunnels, their stealth, their sheer determination. At one point, they came to a section of the tunnel that was blocked by a thick wall of barbed wire. It was a trap set by Finch to prevent anyone from escaping through the sewers. "We're stuck," Eleanor said, her voice filled with despair. "We can't get through." But Felicia refused to give up. She remembered something Arthur had told her, a story about his time in the trenches, about how he had learned to cut through barbed wire using a simple tool. She pulled out the silver button from Henry's uniform, the button she'd found in the velvet box. She used the sharp edge of the button to carefully snip the wires, one by one, creating a small opening. It was slow, painstaking work, but she persevered, her fingers bleeding, her muscles aching. Finally, she managed to create a hole large enough for them to crawl through. They continued their journey, their bodies exhausted, their spirits flagging. But they pressed on, driven by their determination to expose Finch, to avenge Henry and Arthur, to bring justice to the victims of his treachery. As they neared their destination, they could hear the sounds of the city above them, the rumble of traffic, the shouts of street vendors, the distant chimes of Big Ben. They were close. So close. The sounds, previously muffled and distant, grew in intensity, an oral tapestry of London life. Chapter 14. The Spy's Confession. They reached the final section of the sewer, a narrow tunnel that led to a grate, opening onto a quiet alleyway just a few blocks from Scotland Yard. Thomas used his wrench to pry open the grate, and they climbed out, blinking in the sudden brightness of the daylight. They were exhausted, filthy, and battered, but they were free. They had escaped Finch's clutches, and they had the evidence they needed to expose him. They made their way to Scotland Yard, moving quickly and discreetly, avoiding any contact with the police or the public. They reached the imposing building, its granite facade a symbol of law and order, a stark contrast to the dark, chaotic world they had just left behind. They entered the building, approaching the front desk with a mixture of trepidation and determination. Felicia asked to see Inspector Davies, explaining that it was a matter of utmost urgency concerning the late Captain Arthur Monroe. The desk sergeant, A burly man with a skeptical expression hesitated for a moment, then made a phone call. After a brief conversation, he nodded and directed them to a small waiting room. They waited for what seemed like an eternity, their nerves frayed, their bodies aching. Finally, the door opened, and a tall, slender man with gray hair and kind eyes entered the room. It was Inspector Davies. "Mrs. Monroe?" he said, his voice gentle.
I'm Inspector Davies.
"I was a friend of Arthur's. What can I do for you?" Felicia and Eleanor told him everything about the letters, the scarf, the spies, the underground network, the double lock, the lockets, the map, the sewer journey, and finally, the leather-bound book containing the evidence of Finch's treachery. Inspector Davies listened intently, his expression growing graver with each revelation. When they had finished, he sat in silence for a long moment, his fingers drumming on the table. "This is extraordinary," he said finally, his voice filled with disbelief. "Sir Alistair Finch? A traitor? It seems impossible. He's a decorated war hero, a respected member of society, a close friend of the Prime Minister." "But it's true," Felicia said, her voice firm. "We have the proof." She handed him the leather-bound book, the list of names, the coded messages, the maps, the ledgers. Inspector Davies examined the evidence, his eyes widening with each page he turned. "This is damning," he said, his voice low and grave. "This could bring down the entire government." He looked at Felicia and Eleanor, his eyes filled with a mixture of admiration and concern. "You've done a remarkable thing," he said. "You've risked your lives to uncover this conspiracy. But you're still in danger. Finch will stop at nothing to silence you." "We know," Felicia said. "But we're not afraid. We're ready to fight." Inspector Davies nodded. "I'll protect you," he said. "I'll put you under police protection. And I'll launch a full investigation into Finch's activities. I promise you, he will be brought to justice." He called in several officers, ordering them to take Felicia, Eleanor, and Thomas into protective custody. He then made a series of phone calls, contacting his superiors, alerting the intelligence services, setting in motion the wheels of justice. As Felicia and Eleanor were being escorted from the room, Inspector Davies stopped them. "One more thing," he said. "There's something you should know." He handed Felicia a small, sealed envelope. "This was found amongst Arthur's belongings after his death," he said. "It was addressed to you, but it was never delivered. I didn't have the heart to give it to you until now." Felicia took the envelope, her hands trembling. She recognized Arthur's handwriting. She opened it, pulling out a single, folded piece of paper. It was a letter written by Arthur, just days before his death. "My dearest Felicia," the letter began. "If you are reading this, it means I am gone. It means I have failed to protect you, to keep you safe from the darkness that surrounds us. I am sorry. I am so sorry. I have lived a lie, my love. A lie that I have carefully constructed to protect you, to shield you from the truth. I am not the man you think I am. I am a spy, a double agent, working to bring down a network of traitors who have infiltrated the highest levels of our government. I have done terrible things, things that I am ashamed of, things that I can never tell you. But I have done them for a reason. I have done them for my country, for my love for you, and for the hope of a better future. Sir Alistair came to me a few weeks after Henry was killed with the proof. He knew everything. He knew about Henry's mission. He knew I was a double agent. He knew about our relationship. I had no choice. I confessed." Felicia gasped. Arthur's confession. This was it. This was the final piece. Chapter 15. A Train to Nowhere. Felicia continued to read Arthur's letter, her hands trembling, tears streaming down her face. "I know this is difficult for you to understand, my love. But I beg you, believe me. I have always loved you with all my heart, with all my soul. You are the light of my life, the reason I fight, the reason I hold on to hope, even in the darkest of times. I have made arrangements in case of my death. I have left you everything I own, my house, my belongings, my love. But I have also left you something else. A secret. A secret that I have entrusted to a trusted friend, Inspector Davies. He will help you, guide you, protect you. The truth is dangerous, my love. But it is also powerful. It can set you free. It can bring justice to those who have wronged us. It can heal the wounds of the past. I love you, Felicia. I will always love you. And I will be waiting for you on the other side. Your devoted husband, Arthur. Felicia closed the letter, her heart aching with a mixture of grief, love, and understanding. Arthur had been a hero, a true patriot, a man who had sacrificed everything for his country, for his love for her. She looked up at Inspector Davies, her eyes filled with tears. "Thank you," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "Thank you for everything." Inspector Davies nodded, his eyes filled with compassion.
Arthur was a good man, he said.
He was a brave man, and he loved you very much. He escorted them to a safe house, a small, unassuming apartment in a quiet neighborhood where they would be under constant police protection. He assured them that the investigation into Finch's activities was proceeding rapidly and that they would be called upon to testify, to provide evidence, to help bring him to justice. Felicia, Eleanor, and Thomas spent the next few days in the safe house, recovering from their ordeal, sharing their stories, processing the revelations that had changed their lives forever. Felicia and Eleanor, now reunited as sisters, began to forge a new bond, a bond based on shared loss, shared secrets, shared love. They learned more about each other, about their childhoods, their families, their dreams. They discovered that they had much in common, a shared sense of humor, a shared love of literature, a shared passion for justice. They also learned more about Henry, their brother, the man who had brought them together, the man who had sacrificed his life for a cause he believed in. They read his letters, his journals, his poems. They discovered a man of courage, of compassion, of unwavering loyalty. One evening, as they were sitting around the small table in the apartment, sharing a simple meal, they heard a knock on the door. Inspector Davies entered, his face grim. "I have news," he said. "Finch has escaped." Felicia and Eleanor gasped, their hearts sinking. "Escaped?" Felicia said.
"How?"
"He had help," Inspector Davies said. "From inside. Someone within the police force, someone within the intelligence services is still working for him." "We're not safe here," Eleanor said, her voice filled with fear. "He'll find us." Inspector Davies nodded.
"I know," he said.
"That's why I'm moving you. Tonight. To a secure location, outside of London." He explained that he had arranged for them to be transported by train to a remote village in the countryside, where they would be hidden until Finch was captured. "It's a special train," he said. "A ghost train. It doesn't appear on any schedules. It doesn't stop at any stations. It's used by the intelligence services to transport sensitive cargo." They packed their belongings, their hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. They were leaving everything behind, their homes, their lives, their memories. They were embarking on a journey into the unknown, a journey with no destination, no guarantees. They were escorted to a hidden platform beneath King's Cross Station, where the ghost train awaited them. It was a small, unassuming train, with just a few carriages, its windows darkened, its engine silent. They boarded the train, taking their seats in a small, sparsely furnished compartment. The train began to move, slowly at first, then gathering speed, gliding through the tunnels beneath the city. As they journeyed through the darkness, Felicia looked out the window, watching the blurred lights of the city fade away. She thought of Arthur, of Henry, of the sacrifices they had made, the secrets they had kept, the love they had shared. The rhythmic clatter of the train wheels seemed to echo their names, a mournful lullaby for a lost generation. But even in the darkness, there was a flicker of hope. A hope for justice, a hope for peace, a hope for a future where love and truth would prevail. A future where sisters could be reunited, where secrets could be revealed, where heroes could be remembered. The train sped onward, to nowhere and everywhere at once. Chapter 16. The Scarred Map. The train journey continued through the night, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels a constant, hypnotic sound. Felicia, Eleanor, and Thomas sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts, their own fears, their own hopes. The weight of their situation, the constant threat of Finch's pursuit, pressed heavily upon them. Felicia couldn't shake the image of Arthur's letter, his confession, his plea for forgiveness, his unwavering love. She reread the letter several times, each time discovering a new layer of meaning, a new depth of emotion. She realized that Arthur's life had been a tapestry of secrets, woven together with threads of love, duty, and sacrifice. Eleanor, meanwhile, was grappling with the revelation of her true identity, her connection to Felicia, her shared heritage. She felt a mixture of joy, sadness, and anger. Joy at finding her sister, sadness at the years they had lost, anger at the family who had kept them apart. Thomas, too, was wrestling with his own demons. He had betrayed Arthur and Henry, albeit unknowingly, by working for Finch. He felt a deep sense of guilt and need for redemption. He was determined to help Felicia and Eleanor to expose Finch, to atone for his past mistakes. As the train rumbled on, Felicia noticed something peculiar about the compartment. The walls were covered in a faded, patterned wallpaper, depicting scenes of rural life, fields, trees, flowers. But one section of the wallpaper near the window seemed different. She examined it closely, her fingers tracing the outline of the pattern. She realized that it wasn't wallpaper at all. It was a map. A map, cleverly disguised as wallpaper, etched into the very fabric of the train compartment. "Eleanor, Thomas," she said, her voice hushed. "Look at this." They gathered around her, examining the map. It was a detailed map of the British Isles, with various locations marked with symbols, codes, and annotations. Some of the locations were familiar: cities, towns, military bases. Others were unknown: remote villages, secluded estates, hidden facilities. One location, in particular, caught their attention: a small island off the coast of Scotland, marked with a skull and crossbones symbol. And beneath the symbol, written in small, faded letters, were the words, "The Serpent's Lair." The Serpent's Lair. It was clearly Finch's ultimate hideout, his sanctuary, the place where he felt safe, untouchable. "That's where he is," Felicia said, her voice filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "That's where he's hiding. But how do we get there?" Eleanor asked. "It's an island. It's probably heavily guarded." Thomas, who had been studying the map intently, pointed to a series of lines and symbols that ran along the coastline. "There's an underwater tunnel," he said. "A secret passage, built during the war, to connect the island to the mainland." "Can we use it?" Felicia asked. Thomas nodded. "We can," he said. "But it's dangerous. It's probably booby-trapped, guarded, patrolled." They knew it was a risky plan, almost suicidal. But they also knew that it was their only chance to capture Finch, to bring him to justice, to end his reign of terror. They spent the rest of the journey studying the map, memorizing the route, the location of the tunnel, the layout of the island. They knew they couldn't rely on Inspector Davies or the authorities. Finch had infiltrated the highest levels of government, the police, the intelligence services. They were on their own. As dawn approached, the train began to slow down. They had reached their destination, a small, deserted station in the middle of nowhere. The train came to a halt, and the doors hissed open. They stepped out onto the platform, blinking in the pale morning light. They were in a remote, rural area, surrounded by rolling hills, dense forests, and rugged coastline. They were alone. They set off on foot, following the map, heading towards the coast. They knew they had a long and arduous journey ahead of them, a journey that would test their courage, their resilience, their very survival. As they walked, Felicia noticed a series of scars on the map, small, almost invisible lines that crisscrossed the surface. She realized that the scars weren't random. They were deliberate. They formed a pattern, a code. She used the silver button from Henry's uniform, the button that had saved them before, to trace the scars, to decipher the code. She realized that the code was a message from Arthur. "The Serpent's Lair is not what it seems," the message read. "Beware the double cross. Trust no one." The message sent shivers. They were walking into a trap, a meticulously planned deception. But what was the real serpent's lair? Chapter 17. Reunion in Ruins. Arthur's coded message, the serpent's lair, is not what it seems. Beware the double cross. Trust no one. Hung heavy in the air, casting a shadow of doubt over their mission. The island, the underwater tunnel, the supposed hideout, it was all a deception, a carefully orchestrated trap. But what was the real plan? Where was the real serpent's lair? They continued their trek towards the coast, the rugged terrain mirroring the treacherous path they were on. The landscape was beautiful, yet ominous, the vast expanse of sea and sky a reminder of their isolation, their vulnerability. As they neared the coast, they spotted a small, fishing village, nestled in a sheltered cove. It was a picturesque village, with whitewashed cottages, colorful boats bobbing in the harbor, and a sense of timeless tranquility. But Felicia knew that beneath the surface, danger lurked. They decided to approach the village cautiously, seeking information, supplies, and perhaps a way to reach the island, despite Arthur's warning. They needed to understand the deception, to unravel Finch's true plan. They entered the village, posing as travelers, lost and seeking directions. They approached an old fisherman, mending his nets on the quayside. He was a weathered, grizzled man, with eyes that had seen a lifetime of storms and secrets. "Excuse me," Felicia said, her voice polite and unassuming. "Can you help us? We're looking for a way to get to the island." She pointed towards the small, rocky island that loomed offshore, its silhouette shrouded in mist. The old fisherman looked at her, his eyes narrowing. He studied her face, then Eleanor's, then Thomas's. He seemed to be searching for something, a sign of recognition, a hint of deception. "The island?" he said, his voice raspy. "No one goes to the island. It's cursed." "Cursed?" Eleanor asked, her voice skeptical. "Aye," the fisherman said. "Strange things happen there. Lights in the night, unexplained noises, disappearances. It's best to stay away." Felicia knew he was hiding something, withholding information. She decided to press him. "We're not afraid of curses," she said. "We're looking for someone. A man named Finch. Sir Alistair Finch." The fisherman's eyes widened. He dropped his net, his hands trembling. "Finch?" he whispered. He's the devil himself. Do you know him?" Felicia asked, her voice urgent. The fisherman nodded, his eyes filled with fear. "He comes here," he said. "Sometimes. In a big, black car. With his men. They take things." "People." "What do you mean, take people?" Eleanor asked, her voice horrified. "They take them to the island," the fisherman said. "To the old ruins. There's a prison there. A secret place. Where he keeps his enemies. The ruins. A prison. It wasn't a luxurious hideout, a sanctuary. It was a place of torment, of despair. It was a trap, but not the one they had expected." "Can you take us there?" Felicia asked. "To the island?" The fisherman hesitated, his eyes darting around nervously. He was clearly afraid, torn between his fear of Finch and his desire to help. "It's dangerous," he said. "Very dangerous. Finch has eyes everywhere. He knows everything that happens in this village." "We'll pay you," Felicia said. "Anything you want." The fisherman shook his head. "It's not about the money," he said. "It's about survival. But I owe a debt. A debt to a man who saved my life many years ago. A man named Arthur Monroe." Felicia's heart leaped. Arthur. He had connections everywhere, his influence reaching far beyond his grave. "We're Arthur's family," Felicia said. "We're here to finish what he started." The fisherman looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and resignation. "All right," he said. "I'll take you. But we have to be careful. We have to go at night. When the tide is low. When the moon is dark." They agreed on a plan. They would meet the fisherman at midnight, at a secluded cove, away from the village. He would take them to the island in his small fishing boat, navigating the treacherous currents, avoiding Finch's patrols. As they waited for nightfall, they explored the village, gathering information, observing the movements of Finch's men. They discovered that the village was under Finch's control, his influence permeating every aspect of life. The villagers were terrified, living in fear of his wrath. They found a small, ruined church on the outskirts of the village. It was a desolate, forgotten place, its windows shattered, its roof collapsed, its walls covered in ivy. But as they entered the church, they felt a sense of peace, a sense of connection to the past. And then they saw it. A small, stone memorial, hidden in a dark corner of the church. It was a memorial to Henry Rhodes. In loving memory of Captain Henry Rhodes, the inscription read, "Killed in action, 1916. A brave and noble soldier. A beloved son and brother." Beneath the inscription, there was a small, carved image of a forget-me-not flower. Felicia and Eleanor knelt before the memorial, their hearts aching with grief and love. They had found a piece of their brother, a tangible link to their shared past. As they stood there in the ruins of the church, they felt a sense of closure, a sense of purpose. They were not just fighting for justice, for revenge. They were fighting for Henry, for Arthur, for all those who had suffered under Finch's tyranny. They were ready. As twilight deepened into a starless night, the figure of a woman emerged from behind the memorial. She was dressed all in black and was neither Felicia nor Eleanor. Chapter 18. The Weight of Silence. The woman who emerged from behind the memorial was a stranger, yet there was something eerily familiar about her. She was tall and slender, with dark hair pulled back in a severe bun and piercing blue eyes that seemed to see right through them. She wore a simple black dress, unadorned and practical, and carried herself with an air of quiet authority. "Who are you?" Felicia asked, her voice cautious, her hand instinctively reaching for the locket key hidden beneath her dress. The woman smiled, a faint, sad smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "My name is Isabella," she said, her voice soft and cultured, with a trace of a foreign accent. "And I am a friend of Arthur's." Felicia and Eleanor exchanged a look. Another friend of Arthur's? Another secret? It seemed that Arthur's life was an endless labyrinth of hidden connections, unknown alliances. "What are you doing here?" Eleanor asked, her voice skeptical. "I'm here to help you," Isabella said. "Arthur asked me to watch over you. To protect you." "Protect us?" Felicia said. "From whom?" "From Finch," Isabella said. "From the serpent. He is more dangerous than you know. He has eyes and ears everywhere. Even here in this remote village." "We know he's dangerous," Felicia said. "We've been fighting him for weeks. We have evidence of his treachery. We're going to expose him." Isabella nodded. "I know," she said. "I've been following your progress. You've done well, but you're walking into a trap. The island, it's not what you think." "We know," Eleanor said. "Arthur left us a message. A coded message on a map. He warned us about the double cross." Isabella's eyes widened slightly. "He did?" she said. "He was always one step ahead, even in death. But what does it mean?" Felicia asked. "What is the real Serpent's Lair? Where is Finch really hiding?" Isabella hesitated, her gaze flickering towards the darkened windows of the church. She seemed to be weighing her options, deciding how much to reveal. "Finch is not on the island," she said finally. "He's using it as a decoy, a distraction. His real base of operations is elsewhere." "Where?" Felicia and Eleanor asked, almost in unison. Isabella took a deep breath. "Arlington," she said. "Your home, Mrs. Monroe. The antique mirror. That's the key. That's the entrance to the Serpent's Lair." Felicia gasped, her mind reeling. Her home? The mirror? It seemed impossible, yet it made a strange kind of sense. The vision of Henry Rhodes, the engraved name, the hidden key, it had all been leading back to Arlington, back to the beginning. But how? Felicia stammered. "How is that possible?" "The mirror is not just a mirror," Isabella explained. "It's a portal, a gateway to a hidden network of tunnels, chambers, facilities. Built centuries ago by a secret society, a group of alchemists, spies, revolutionaries. Finch discovered it years ago. He's been using it ever since." "So, all this time," Eleanor began, then fell silent. The weight of the deception, The scale of Finch's operation was almost overwhelming. He had been hiding in plain sight, using their own home, their own memories against them. He had used the antique mirror as a strategic center point. "We have to go back," Felicia said, her voice filled with a new determination. "We have to stop him." "It's too dangerous," Isabella said. "Finch will be expecting you. He'll have set traps, guards, defenses." "We have no choice," Felicia said. "We can't let him win. We have to finish what Arthur started." They made a plan. They would return to Arlington, using the old fisherman's boat to get back to the mainland, then making their way back to London, avoiding Finch's patrols, using the underground network, the sewer system, any means necessary. Isabella would accompany them, providing her knowledge, her expertise, her connections. She revealed that she was a member of a secret organization, an international network of spies and operatives, dedicated to fighting corruption, tyranny, and injustice. She had been working with Arthur for years, helping him infiltrate Finch's network, gathering intelligence, protecting him from harm. As they prepared to leave the church, Isabella stopped them. "There's one more thing," she said. "Something you should know about Finch. He's not just a traitor. He's obsessed. Obsessed with power, with control, with you, Mrs. Monroe." Felicia felt a chill run down her spine.
"Me?" she said. "Why?"
"Because of Arthur," Isabella said. "Because of your love for him. Finch saw your love as a weakness, a vulnerability. He wanted to destroy it, to possess it, to make it his own. He sees you as a trophy, a prize to be won." Felicia's blood ran cold. She realized that the danger was even greater than she had imagined. Finch wasn't just after their evidence, their lives. He was after something more, something personal, something deeply twisted. The silence around them was not empty, it was filled with unspoken fears, with the heavy weight of a past that refused to stay buried. Chapter 19. The Unsent Letter. They left the church under the cover of darkness, the old fisherman guiding them to a secluded cove where his small boat was hidden. The sea was calm, the sky a vast expanse of stars, but the tranquility was deceptive, masking the danger that lurked beneath the surface. They boarded the boat, and the fisherman started the engine, a low, throbbing sound that echoed across the water. As they sailed away from the island, Felicia looked back at the silhouette of the ruined church, the memorial to Henry, the village shrouded in secrets. She felt a sense of sadness, of loss, but also a sense of determination, a resolve to finish what they had started. The journey back to the mainland was uneventful, the fishermen navigating the treacherous currents with skill and experience. They reached the shore just before dawn, landing at a deserted beach, far from any towns or villages. They thanked the fisherman, offering him payment, which he refused, his only request being that they bring Finch to justice. They set off on foot, heading towards London, following the coastline, avoiding the main roads, using the cover of darkness to conceal their movements. They traveled for several days, sleeping in abandoned barns, foraging for food, relying on Isabella's knowledge of the countryside, her connections to a network of safe houses, sympathetic farmers, and resistance fighters. As they neared London, they entered the familiar underground network, the tunnels and abandoned stations that had become their second home. They moved quickly and silently, avoiding Finch's patrols, the constant threat of discovery hanging over them. They reached Mrs. Abernathy's house, the starting point of their journey, the place where they had discovered the first clues, the first secrets. They knocked on the door, and Mrs. Abernathy greeted them with a mixture of relief and concern. "You're back," she said, her voice trembling. "I was worried about you. Finch's men have been searching for you. They've been asking questions, watching the house." "We know," Felicia said. "We're being careful. We need to get to Arlington." "To the mirror." Mrs. Abernathy nodded, understanding the urgency of their mission. She led them to the secret passage behind the bookcase, the entrance to the hidden network that led to Felicia's home. "Be careful, my dears," she said. "Finch is a dangerous man, and he's waiting for you." They entered the passage, descending into the darkness, the air growing colder, the silence more profound. They reached the end of the passage, a small, hidden chamber beneath Felicia's house. They were home, but it didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like a battleground, a place of secrets and lies, a place where danger lurked around every corner. They climbed the stairs, emerging into the familiar surroundings of Felicia's house. The house was silent, empty, seemingly deserted. But Felicia knew that Finch was there, somewhere, waiting for them. They went to the study, the room where it had all begun, the room with the antique mirror. The mirror stood in its usual place, its silvered surface reflecting the dim light of the room. As Felicia approached the mirror, she felt a surge of emotion, a mixture of fear, anticipation, and recognition. She remembered the vision of Henry Rhodes, his sorrowful eyes, the engraved name. She remembered the feeling of connection, the sense of destiny. She reached out and touched the mirror, her fingers tracing the intricate carvings of the roses. She pressed the hidden button, and the small section of the frame swung open, revealing the hidden cavity. But the cavity was empty. The silver key was gone. Felicia gasped, her heart sinking.
He's been here, she said. He knows about the mirror.
He knows about the key. Isabella examined the mirror, her eyes scanning the surface, the frame, the carvings.
He's changed the code, she said.
He's altered the mechanism. The old key won't work anymore. They were trapped. They had come all this way, risked everything, only to find themselves back where they started, facing an insurmountable obstacle. Suddenly, Eleanor spoke. The letters, she said. Henry's letters. There might be something there, a clue, a hint, a message. They rushed to the box of letters, the letters from Henry to Arthur, the letters that had revealed so much, that had guided them on their journey. They searched through the letters, frantically, desperately, looking for anything that might help them. And then Felicia found it. A letter that she hadn't noticed before, a letter that was tucked away at the bottom of the box, a letter that was unsent. It was a letter from Henry to Felicia. A letter that had never been mailed, a letter that had been written just days before his death. My dearest Felicia, the letter began. If you are reading this, it means I am gone. It means I have failed to tell you the truth, to share my secrets, to express my love. I know this will come as a shock, my love. But you are not Arthur's wife. You are my wife. We were married in secret, just weeks before I was sent to the front. Arthur was our witness, our confidant, our protector. I love you, Felicia. I have always loved you. And I will always love you. And I will be waiting for you on the other side. The signature, your devoted husband, Henry. Felicia's world turned upside down. The unsent letter was a bomb, exploding the foundations of her life, her memories, her very identity. Chapter 20. The Reckoning of Love and Duty. Felicia stared at the letter, her mind numb, her body trembling. Henry's words, "You are my wife," echoed in her head, shattering everything she had believed to be true. Her marriage to Arthur, her grief, her entire identity, it had all been a lie. A carefully constructed deception, designed to protect her, to shield her from the truth. Tears streamed down her face, a mixture of shock, grief, betrayal, and a strange, unexpected surge of joy. Henry. He had loved her. He had married her. She was his wife. Eleanor, reading over her shoulder, gasped. "Henry, he was your husband?" she said, her voice filled with disbelief. Felicia nodded, unable to speak, the weight of the revelation crushing her. Isabella, ever the pragmatist, broke the silence. "We don't have time for this," she said, her voice urgent. "Finch is waiting. We need to find a way to open the mirror." But Felicia couldn't move. She was lost in a maelstrom of emotions, struggling to reconcile the past with the present, the truth with the lies. She looked at Eleanor, her sister, Henry's sister. Their connection was even deeper, more profound than they had realized. "The mirror," Felicia said, her voice barely a whisper. "The inscription. Captain Henry Rhodes." She realized that the inscription wasn't just a name. It was a key, a code, a password. She approached the mirror, her heart pounding. She touched the glass, her fingers tracing the engraved letters. She spoke the words, her voice clear and strong. Captain Henry Rhodes. As she spoke the name, the mirror shimmered, the silvered surface rippling like water. The image of the room dissolved, replaced by a swirling vortex of light and color. A hidden mechanism clicked, and the mirror swung open, revealing a dark, narrow passageway. It was the entrance to the serpent's lair. They had found it. They entered the passageway, Isabella leading the way, Felicia and Eleanor close behind. The passage sloped downwards, leading them deeper and deeper beneath the house, into the hidden network of tunnels and chambers. They reached a large, vaulted chamber, the heart of the serpent's lair. The chamber was filled with sophisticated equipment, computers, maps, communication devices. It was a command center, a hub of espionage and treachery. And in the center of the chamber, standing before a large, holographic display, was Sir Alistair Finch. He turned to face them, a slow, sinister smile spreading across his face. "Welcome, Mrs. Monroe," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Or should I say, Mrs. Rhodes? I've been expecting you." "Finch," Felicia said, her voice filled with hatred. "It's over. We have the evidence. We know everything." Finch laughed, a cold, cruel laugh. "Evidence?" he said. "You have nothing. I control everything. The government, the police, the intelligence services. They are all in my pocket." "Not anymore," Isabella said, stepping forward. "Your network is being dismantled. Your allies are being arrested. Your reign of terror is over." Finch's smile vanished. His eyes narrowed, his expression turning to fury. You betrayed me," he said, his voice trembling. "I was never loyal to you, Finch," Isabella said. "I was loyal to Arthur, to Henry, to justice." Finch lunged at Isabella, his hands reaching for her throat. But Isabella was too quick. She sidestepped his attack, grabbing his arm, twisting it behind his back. She disarmed him, forcing him to his knees. "It's over, Finch," she said, her voice cold and hard. "You're finished." Finch looked at Felicia, his eyes filled with a mixture of hatred and longing. You were supposed to be mine," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You were supposed to love me." Felicia stared at him, her heart filled with pity and disgust. "I never loved you, Finch," she said. "I loved Henry. And I always will." At that moment, Inspector Davies and a squad of armed police officers burst into the chamber, their weapons trained on Finch. Davies had used the information from the map found in Eleanor's locket and Thomas's knowledge of the sewer network to finally track them down. "Sir Alistair Finch," Inspector Davies said, his voice booming. "You are under arrest. For treason, for espionage, for murder." Finch was taken into custody, his empire crumbling around him. The evidence they had gathered, the letters, the documents, the testimony of Isabella, Thomas, and the old fisherman, would ensure his conviction. As Finch was being led away, he looked at Felicia one last time, his eyes filled with a chilling emptiness. "This isn't over," he whispered. "I'll be back." But Felicia knew it was over. Finch's power was broken. His secrets were exposed. His reign of terror was at an end. Felicia, Eleanor, and Isabella stood together in the chamber, the silence broken only by the hum of the equipment, the echoes of the past. They had won. They had avenged Henry and Arthur. They had brought justice to the victims of Finch's treachery. But the victory was bittersweet. The scars of the past, the weight of the secrets, the pain of loss, would remain. The fight had changed them, forged them anew, bonded them together in ways they could never have imagined. They emerged from the hidden chamber. Morning sun poured into the study. Epilogue. The aftermath of Finch's arrest was a whirlwind of activity. The news of his treachery sent shockwaves through the government, the intelligence services, and the public. There were investigations, trials, resignations, and a profound sense of betrayal. The country grappled with the realization that a decorated war hero, a respected member of society, had been a double agent, a traitor, for years. Felicia, Eleanor, and Isabella testified at Finch's trial, providing the crucial evidence that led to his conviction. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, his name forever tarnished, his legacy reduced to ashes. Thomas, who had played a vital role in their mission, was granted immunity from prosecution in exchange for his cooperation. He returned to his former life, a changed man, haunted by his past but determined to make amends. Mrs. Abernathy, the eccentric aunt who had provided the key to the mirror, was hailed as a heroine, her knowledge of London's hidden history proving invaluable. She continued to live in her cluttered house, surrounded by her books and artifacts, a guardian of secrets and a keeper of memories. Felicia and Eleanor, reunited as sisters, began to rebuild their lives. They sold Felicia's house in Arlington, the memories of Finch's presence, the secrets of the mirror, too painful to bear. They moved to the countryside, to a small cottage near the sea, not far from the village where they had found the memorial to Henry. They spent their days exploring the countryside, reading, writing, gardening, and simply enjoying each other's company. They talked about Henry, about Arthur, about the past, about the future. They healed, slowly but surely, the wounds of war, of betrayal, of loss. Felicia finally came to terms with the truth about her marriage. She realized that her love for Arthur had been real, even if it had been based on a lie. He had been a good man, a kind man, a man who had protected her, even at the cost of his own happiness. But her love for Henry was different. It was a deeper, more profound love, a love that had transcended time, distance, and even death. It was the love she had felt echoing from the mirror. One day, as they were walking along the beach, Felicia noticed something glinting in the sand. She bent down and picked it up. It was a small, silver locket, identical to the ones she and Eleanor wore. She opened it, her heart pounding. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a small, folded piece of paper. It was a photograph of Henry, Felicia, and Arthur, standing together, smiling, their arms around each other. They were young, happy, and full of life. It was a photograph taken on Felicia and Henry's secret wedding day, a day she had always believed belonged to Arthur. On the back of the photograph, in Henry's handwriting, were the words, "Forever and always." Felicia held the locket to her heart, tears streaming down her face. She had found her true love, her true family, her true self. She had come full circle, back to the beginning, but with a new understanding, a new appreciation, a new hope. The war was over. The secrets were revealed. The wounds were healing. And love, in all its forms, had endured. As the sun set over the tranquil sea, casting a golden glow on the sand, Felicia and Eleanor walked hand in hand, two sisters, reunited by fate, bound by love, and forever connected by the echoes of the past. The sound of the waves whispered a final, peaceful goodbye. The end.